Hello, welcome everyone at today's HEAS Paleogenomics seminar. We are delighted to have Mehmet Somel from the Middle East Technical University visiting us today. And he is a professor there for more than 10 years already. And before that, he was doing a PhD at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, but he left before I joined. We didn't meet there, but we only met afterwards. And followed by postdoc time with Rasmus Nielsen in Berkeley and Philip Kajtovic in Shanghai. And he's working on the paleogenomics of humans and animals and on many other topics, evolution and aging and so on. And today he will tell us something about the paleogenomics of Neolithic Anatolia. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Ron, for the very kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming, of course. So I'll be telling you about Neolithic Anatolia, and I work as part of a team at the METÜ and the Hacettepe, so two universities in Ankara. Ancient DNA team with multiple PIs. I'm one of them, and we've been for the last for the last 5-10 years or something. We've been studying the Neolithic transition in Anatolia, so that's been the bulk, the focus of our work, where we screened about 1,000 skeletons from this period when people were switching from mobile foraging to sedentism and food production, agriculture, and animal husbandry. So we've produced about 300 usable genomes from this period from a couple of dozen villages. And the main questions we've been tackling are how did these folks organize, how were their social structures, their social relationships, and how this changed over time. And also how their different cultures, different ways of doing things might have been shaped by different types of mobility among villages, among regions. And before I go into the main part of the talk, which will be about one main site, I'll just briefly talk about another study which regarding the last topic, about how different types of mobility shaped cultural variation. And here we've been focused on how the Neolithic spread from its core region in the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Central Anatolia westward, first to West Anatolia. So this is Anatolia, this is Greece. First to West Anatolia, and then further into Europe. And we, interestingly, we find a couple of different modes happening, taking part. So one is people, local groups adopting Neolithic elements, starting building permanent settlements without any visible genetic admixture, probably with some contact, but without visible admixture, happening already around 9 to 8,000 BC. And then we see a larger movement into West Anatolia from these core regions, and admixture, both cultural adoption happening and admixture happening, leading to emergence of Neolithic villages in West Anatolia. And then this final out of Anatolia movement into Greece and Balkans, that we infer was happening mainly by large groups of people moving, what we might term migration. So yeah, the different types of ways people moved about and that shaped culture. And one thing in this study, what we also asked was how much might cultural differences that we see among villages, among settlements, might they be shaped by genetic similarities, representing admixture history. And to address this, our archaeologist colleagues compiled a list of about 60 material culture elements from pottery, tools, stone tools, or architecture, and we compared it with the genetic similarity among these villages to ask if cultural similarities can be explained by genetics. So what we find is that the geographic proximity among villages, it's highly correlated with culture, as shown in this caricature. The genetic similarities are also correlated with the genetic similarities are also correlated with geographic similarities. So closer you are genetically, you're more similar. But once you correct for the geographic proximity effect, so once you correct for geographic similarity, there's no additional explanatory power of genetics on culture. So the cultural similarity seems to be shaped mainly by processes that are not visible in the genetics, which probably makes sense because, you know, to learn a culture, adopt something, you don't really need like a 20% or 50% of village population moving in or out. Yeah, but of course, this is a, you know, small sample, so it would be very cool if you know, our colleagues in the field of archaeogenetics adopt this type of methodology and perhaps develop it even further to see, really understand, try to better understand how cultural variation is shaped by mobility, different types of mobility processes. Okay, but the main part of the talk, the main focus will be a site that we've been studying in central Anatolia called Çatalhöyük. It dates to the pottery Neolithic period. So when human groups had been adopting full-scale agriculture and animal husbandry, and also pottery. So it's relatively late Neolithic in our region, whereas, of course, by that time, still Neolithic was absent in parts of Europe. And this is a site known for a couple of its features. So for one thing, it was relatively large. It housed about a couple of hundreds to even thousands of people, so the estimates vary. But it was a relatively large village. People were living in these juxtaposed mud brick buildings. And it's known as a house society. So there are no public buildings yet discovered. People were mainly doing their things within houses. And the houses themselves have relatively regular plans. So there was they were entered from the rooftop, and in the south there was usually the hearth or the oven area, the dirty area, and in the north there was the clean platforms. They also buried their dead under the houses, which makes our life very convenient during the occupation, during the use of the houses, which was a couple of generations. So they used to dig up, cut a hole, bury the dead, cover it up, and continue, you know, living above their ancestors. We also see patterns such as the babies, the infants, children being buried more in the oven, in the dirty area, in the kitchen area, whereas adults being buried more often in the clean area under the platforms. So another thing worth of mention is that the Çatalhöyük society appears to be relatively egalitarian. So there are relatively larger houses and smaller houses, but the larger houses aren't necessarily more full of stuff. Their burials are not necessarily richer. So there doesn't seem to be so much of a diet variation that would indicate that there was a class structure. So similar to other Neolithic villages of the time, there doesn't seem to be any class appearance, class type of organization appearing in Çatalhöyük. So there's also no evidence for lethal violence, for instance. So there are some individuals with trauma, with traces of trauma, but there doesn't seem to be any lethal wounds detected in the skeletons, hundreds of skeletons that have been studied yet, which kind of contrasts with later coming societies, both in the region and also in Europe. Çatalhöyük is also famous for its imagery, so with wall paintings and also these figurines. So they've been discovered plenitude of especially female figurines, these mature-looking individuals. Those figurines were also the reason why Çatalhöyük was speculated as being potentially a matriarchal society. All the way back in the 20th century, and the idea has been revived more recently by the Graeber and Wengrow book. But this has been controversial for two reasons at least. One is that there doesn't seem to be in other respects of bioarchaeology or archaeology. So with respect to burial gifts, for instance, or with respect to diet, there doesn't seem to be any clear indication of sex differences in Çatalhöyük among the adults. There did not exist such evidence yet. And another reason is that the figurines themselves, their social roles have been a bit unclear in that they're frequently found in midden areas in rather than being appearing as being treated as sacred. They seem to be somewhat discarded. In many times they've been found. So it's not really clear what kind of social role they exactly played. So the question of whether Çatalhöyük was a society where females had extra authority or not has been debated. Has been an open question. So we've been collaborating with the Çatalhöyük excavation team for about 10 years now, and we screened about 400 skeletons excavated from the site. About 180 of them had enough DNA to be screened. Overall, the DNA preservation was pretty low, so less than 1% endogenous DNA for most skeletons. But 180 had enough data for sexing, and here's the X and Y relative coverages, and we have similar numbers of males and females, a bit more male, a bit more frequent female adults than male adults. For sub-adults, it was 50-50. We had one Turner individual here, as you see. We also had enough DNA to do kinship, to estimate the genetic kinship for about 130 of them. The average coverage is not super high, as you see, but we still could make use of data for quite a few. One other interesting aspect of the data set is that we had 4 times more sub-adults than adults, and that turns out to be because the adults had particularly low DNA preservation. So here you have endogenous DNA, human DNA proportion in log scale, as you notice, and this is the adult distribution and the sub-adult distribution. And there's like 2 orders of magnitude lower adult DNA preservation than sub-adults. And we think this is not necessarily a biological attribute because in other data sets that we have, and also in other published data sets, we don't see this difference. So we think it's probably something to do with how adult bodies were treated before death. Perhaps we think sub-adults might be buried directly, whereas adults might be dried or perhaps smoked or treated in some ways that was not favorable for DNA preservation. But the end result is that our data set is enriched for sub-adults, which makes our life a bit more difficult, of course, with respect to constructing pedigrees. Okay, so I'll be talking about 2 main questions. One about how these individuals buried inside buildings, how they were related, and then we'll talk about gender roles. So the question of how these people buried in the same building might be related or not is not so trivial, because in modern-day forager groups, we know that communities are not so much organized around biological relatedness. You can have communities, bands who are frequently composed of individuals. Many individuals can be biologically unrelated. And perhaps similar or resounding that is the finding that in a few studies that studied pre-agricultural groups, the burials, multiple burials from pre-agricultural groups, like this Sungur burials here you see from the Upper Paleolithic in Russia. People who were buried in the same space turned out not to be biological relatives. Whereas in modern-day agricultural groups and also pastoralist groups, societies seem to be organized much more frequently along biological relatedness lines. And here's a study from Pair, published this year, another study from England. The first one is from Slovakia, the other one from Britain, where we have clusters of burials that are frequently, that involve frequently biological relatives. And so this suggests there might have been a shift in how, what determined people to be buried together, and perhaps also how society was organized from forager, mobile forager context to agriculturalist context. And so the question is like how these Neolithic societies in Anatolia, where they might fit in that picture. So we've been studying this question for a couple of years now, and some early data that we produced, not just from Çatalhöyük, but also from even earlier Neolithic sites in Anatolia. One, for instance, here you see is Çatalhöyük. It's 1,000 years earlier than Çatalhöyük, also from the same region. And you see two buildings, and again, burials, intramural burials within the buildings. And what we find is that people buried in the same building or in neighboring buildings are frequently relatives. We have two siblings here, and again, two siblings that we infer between these neighboring buildings. Not everybody is related. So, for instance, this young woman was not related to anybody else. So it's not an exclusive rule, but both in this site and also in other contemporary villages, early Neolithic villages, we find people buried in the same building, frequently being close biological relatives. Whereas our preliminary data that we published in 2021 from Çatalhöyük and also some other sites suggested that in the later Neolithic, this rule might not apply, at least as strictly anymore. So we had multiple burials from different buildings, as you see. This is Çatalhöyük, and the blue spaces show burials who were not related with anybody else in the same building. We had two siblings here, but the rest of the individuals that we found were unrelated to anybody else in the same building. But the sample size were very small, so we couldn't really put our hand in fire to say this was a real difference. The data we had comparing the early Neolithic and the late Neolithic suggested there might have been a shift in the rules determining whether people buried in the same space were related or not. But again, because we had only limited sample size, we couldn't be sure. So now with our new data, with our much larger Çatalhöyük data set, we went back to this question again. And here you're seeing a summary of the data. So we have, as I was telling you, about more than 100 individuals buried in more than 20 buildings in Çatalhöyük. So this is time on the y-axis, the two regions of the mound. And the different colors indicate different buildings. So each point is an individual, and the links show biological relatedness. The dark lines show first-degree relatives. The lighter lines show third-degree relatives like cousins. And you see a lot of connections. But one pattern that emerges is that individuals who were buried in the same building were, first-degree relatives were always, all the first-degree relationships we found were buried in the same building. So that was without exception. And another pattern before that, I can give you an example. So this is a set of sub-adults buried in this building number 6, and we could construct a pedigree of them. The parents are missing. They're all neonates, infants, prenatal, as you see. And they all are buried in the same space. Whereas we also, when looking at the data in over time, we also notice an interesting trend that the proportion of relatives buried in the same space over time seem to decrease across the occupation of the site. So the early buildings had a relatively high frequency of relatives, like early Neolithic sites we had studied previously, whereas the later buildings had fewer and fewer relatives. Of course, the sample is very heterogeneous, so there are different numbers of burials in different buildings, and the proportion of subadults and adults is also different. So we had to run a lot of simulations simulations of the null hypothesis that there is no difference over periods, over time, with respect to family structure. But in all these simulations, we could never recapitulate this decreasing trend that we observe in the real data. So we think this is a real phenomenon, that the genetic links among individuals buried in the same building within the site indeed decreased over time. Yeah, so what could be explaining this pattern? So let me show you first a couple of more examples of how this looks like, of people not genetically connected being buried in the same building. So we have some buildings where we have multiple families. So for instance, here we have these purple burials, purple-colored burials, creating a small pedigree here, who turn out to be related. And these two green burials here, another small pedigree, who are also related, but the purple and green families are unrelated from to each other. And we have also these two gray burials who were also genetically studied, but they were unrelated to anybody else in the building. And then we also have these more extreme cases. So we have from this building 4 neonates, so individuals buried between who died between birth and 2 months of age. 4 neonates buried in a side room of a building, and all of them are unrelated to each other. So that made us wonder whether this could be, they might have, these individuals might have been coming from different buildings, they might have lived in different buildings, and then just ended up being buried in the same space for whatever reason. Or perhaps their mothers might also have been living in the same space, might be sharing some aspect of their environment, and that also led to their being buried in the same building. So to address this, we were lucky enough to have access to diet data, dietary isotope data, nitrogen and carbon, that was already published. And we had the data from 13 late period neonates. Again, these are individuals between 0 to 2 months of age. And our diet expert tells us that their dietary profiles, so the isotopic profiles, is mainly reflecting what the mothers were eating during pregnancy. So we're in a sense looking at the mother's diets, mother's dietary similarities. And here you see the data. So each point is one of the neonates, and the colors indicate the different buildings they come from. So these are from the two orange points are from one building, the red points are from another building, the green points are another building. And the ones which are filled in are biologically related, pairs who are biologically related. And the unfilled ones are groups of individuals who are not related to anybody else in their building. And for instance, if you look at the red ones or the orange ones, although they seem to be sharing some aspects of their diet, they are unrelated, genetically unrelated to each other, which makes us think that somehow their mothers might be actually eating similar diets, and their kids were also buried in the same building, but being genetically unrelated. So we think it could be people actually living together in the same households that caused them being buried in the same building. Of course, it's still limited data, but it does suggest that the society was organized in new ways. And just to sum up this part, in early Çatalhöyük, similar to even earlier Neolithic villages that we've studied in Anatolia, we find that buildings were occupied by nuclear or extended families. Whereas in later coming periods of Çatalhöyük, we see a change in practices about determining who was buried where, and perhaps also how the households were, the household composition itself, and why people who were genetically unrelated started more frequently living together, if that is indeed true, is of course it's a matter of speculation. But one potential explanation could be maintaining communal lines. So many societies, many traditional societies, both foragers and agriculturalist groups, they adopt adoption and fostering, child fostering, much more frequently than modern day Western societies. Even in our societies, fostering and adoption are not so uncommon. But in some societies, it's even much more often observed. And one of the functions is thought to be to maintain more equal, I would say, to foster communal connections within society, to maintain balance and I would say, to keep harmony within the society. And it could be that this kind of shift in organization could have served Çatalhöyük society in this way. Okay, and the second part of the talk will be about gendered practices. So as I told you, there was a speculation about whether Çatalhöyük and other Aegean Neolithic societies might have been matriarchal based on these figurines, but it was a matter of dispute. So this is also interesting because a lot of data has been coming out recently especially on European Neolithic and Bronze Age societies, where when people construct pedigrees, they find that individuals buried in the same place are not just biologically related, they're mainly related through the paternal line. You see a pedigree here that runs through the male line. Some of the groups, and they've been published more recently, many large pedigrees, many data from large cemeteries, indicating, again, mainly paternal relationships. These societies, as you might remember, are actually originating from Neolithic Anatolia. So whether this kind of paternal organization, patrilocal organization was already present in Anatolia or not has been a question. So when we were looking at the pedigrees we have, you might already have noticed, so whenever we could construct links between individuals buried in the same building, these were mainly sub-adults, so many times we don't have the adults themselves, but when we can infer the links involving adults, of individuals buried in the same building, they were female links, so they went through the maternal line. This is one example I'd already shown you. And we also find adult females buried with, again, adult female relatives, which again speaks against a strict patrilocal organization. So if you have two adult females related being buried together, that suggests that females, when they reach maturity, did not have to move outside of the group. But because our adult data is relatively limited, we decided to study this also using mitochondria and Y chromosome haplogroups. So here you're looking at haplogroup diversity of chromosome Y and mitochondria, not in Çatalhöyük, but another site, published site from France in Gurji. And there's already a pedigree constructed for this community, about 100 burials from a single cemetery, and nearly all the links go through the paternal line. I mean, it's not easy to see here, but you can take my word. So it's a very highly patrilocal group. And accordingly, the Y chromosome diversity in this group is very low. Mitochondrial diversity is much higher because females were moving into the community while males were resident. So how does the picture look like in Çatalhöyük? We still have slightly more mitochondrial diversity, but the Y chromosome diversity is also on a par with mitochondrial diversity. So together with the previous evidence I showed you, we believe there was no strong tendency for males or females moving in. So both sexes moved into the community. I didn't have time to show you, but we have also evidence that suggests the community was receiving incomers across its occupation, and there doesn't seem to be any sex bias with respect to males or females for these incomers. So no strict patrilocality. But this person I'm showing you is the master's student. You also notice some other and even more interesting aspects looking into the data about sex bias mobility among the buildings, not into the community, but among buildings. And again, coming back to this picture I showed you before, the groups of individuals buried inside the same building were connected through the maternal line for this building, for the two pedigrees. But for other pedigrees, we also saw the same picture. So here we have individuals buried in, again, the same building at different phases in building 1, and they all seem to be maternal cousins. So cousins buried that are connected through the maternal line. Yet another building, again, connected through the maternal line. So there are a few exceptions. Those we do have some individuals who were connected through the paternal line, but it seems to be the exception rather than the rule. But of course, this is also qualitative data. So Sıdık decided to study this also quantitatively to try to estimate how much of a matrilocal bias there might be among these buildings. So what he did was he collected a couple of statistics. One was haplogroup homozygosity. So it's just the opposite of what I was showing you before. So we're looking at how different mitochondrial DNA in blue and chromosome Y in red, how different individuals are buried in the same building from each other. So with respect to mitochondrial, sorry, not how different, I'm so sorry, how similar they are. It's homozygosity, of course. As you see in early period buildings, but also into late period buildings, individuals buried in the same building frequently, when they're related, they're frequently sharing the same mitochondrial DNA, whereas sharing chromosome Y haplogroups is much less common. And when you do the same between buildings, chromosome Y similarity is the same as within buildings, whereas mitochondrial DNA similarity is much lower. So pairs buried in different buildings frequently have different mitochondrial DNA, but if they're buried in the same building, they have the same mitochondrial DNA haplogroup. We also used another set of statistics. We looked at the kinship coefficient on autosomes versus the X chromosome, and the difference between X and, this should be autosome, X chromosome kinship coefficient differences. And if connections are mainly through the maternal line, we expect negative values. So we expect the X chromosome kinship coefficient to be higher. So this difference in kinship coefficients between autosome and X chromosome to be more negative. And indeed, within buildings, we find more negative values than between buildings. So again, this suggests that there were more connections through the maternal line. We then tried to more directly quantify this effect using simulations and ABC framework. So we simulated multiple generations across 100 buildings in a village under different types of assumptions, different numbers of generations, different numbers of families occupying a same building, and under varying levels of matrilocality or patrilocality. So he had 100% matrilocal villages, 100% patrilocal villages, or bilocal villages. And then he compared the same statistics I showed you from the simulations with the observed data. So this is one set of simulations he produced with 4 generations per building, two biological families occupying the same building. And the purple distribution shows Y haplogroup homozygosity under a full matrilocality, and the green distribution on the right-hand side shows the Y chromosome Y haplogroup homozygosity when it's fully patrilocal. Because we allow two families per building, you still have a distribution, and so the histograms show what we see from simulations, and the dashed lines show what we observe in the real data in the early period and middle period and late period Çatalhöyük. And overall, using this comparison, we could estimate how much matrilocality might best explain the data, posterior probability for the matrilocality rate. We first ran this using the simulated scenario. So under matrilocal scenario, can we get a posterior probability that makes sense? And indeed, when we have a matrilocal data and analyze it with compared to other simulations, we do find matrilocality, 100% matrilocality. So on the x-axis, we have matrilocality rate, and 100% matrilocality has the highest posterior. If we run a patrilocal scenario, 100% patrilocality or 0% matrilocality has the highest posterior. And this is the real data. If we assume a single family occupying a building, then about 70% matrilocality explains the data best. If we assume two families occupying a building, then 100% matrilocality explains the data best. Of course, which of these assumptions is correct, we don't exactly know, but what we can clearly say is that there was a strong trend for women staying within the building, or at least their progeny being buried in the building, whereas men moving around different buildings. Okay, and my final result. So that, of course, excited us, suggesting there could indeed be a female-centered set of practices going on in Çatalhöyük. But then we're looking for evidence for potential other practices that might also suggest some sex differences. And we went back to some burial object data that people had studied before, but where they had not found a strong difference between females and males in terms of burial objects. So there was a trend for females being adorned with more objects, but it was not statistically significant. But of course, before DNA was available, subadults could not be sexed. So now we could sex the subadults. And what we found was that females were receiving 5 times or more burial gifts than males. Female subadults were being adorned by many more burial objects. And this also applies to different types of objects. So it's not just that, males perhaps were adorned by more perishable stuff, for also things like wood objects or baskets. Females seem to be, female subadult burials seem to be receiving more stuff than male subadults. So that concludes the story. So we don't, in Çatalhöyük, we don't see evidence for sex-biased regional mobility, but we do see evidence for maternal connections mainly within burials within the same building, so which could be compatible with some kind of matrilineal organization, although, I mean, we can't, of course, know how they were exactly identifying themselves. We also see a clear preference towards adorning female subadult burials over male subadult burials. And what we can say is that this picture is very much different from the picture people have seen from the Neolithic and Bronze Age in Europe, where whenever you do detect sex differences, it seems to suggest more male-centered organization, at least until, I mean, I'm sure we will find more exceptions to that, but that seems to be the main pattern yet published. And yeah, so that also brings about the question, like, when did things change? Because the European Neolithic was, as we mentioned it, both culturally and population-wise, it had its origins in Anatolia, which apparently didn't have a male-centered culture, male-centered set of practices. So sometimes some things changed. Why? Yeah, that's probably a question for future work. So I have to thank the Çatalhöyük excavation team that were really, they were the reason I went into ancient DNA. I wasn't an ancient DNA person initially, more than 10 years ago. And also my colleagues in Ankara, we've been working with. It's the result of a lot of people's very hard work, not so much mine. So I thank all of them. Thank you.